This is the Death Row and Executions channel. Here is your host, Paco Rivera.
Welcome back to the Death Row and Executions channel. I am Paco Rivera. You can also follow me on Facebook for updates and more Death Row news. There will be a link to my Facebook in the description below. Also, check out my other channel here on YouTube called The Maximum Sentence, where I cover recent crimes and convictions and a maximum penalty handed down. There will be a link for that as well. There are 2 executions scheduled for September 26. One is 59-year-old Alan Miller in Alabama. The video on that case appeared on this channel back in the year 2022 when Miller was previously scheduled for execution, but it got called off in the execution chamber because handlers were unable to access Alan Miller's veins. This time, Alabama plans to execute Miller with nitrogen gas. The other death row inmate scheduled to be executed this coming September 26 is 52-year-old Emmanuel Littlejohn in Oklahoma, the case that I will be discussing today. Emmanuel Littlejohn is expected to be executed for a crime that he committed along with an accomplice in the year 1992, 32 years ago, in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. At about 10:15 in the evening on June 19, 1992, both men, Littlejohn and his partner, a man named Glenn Bethany, entered a convenience store to rob the place. They obtained cash from an employee at the register and were headed out the door. The convenience store manager, Kenneth Meers, unfortunately decided to charge at both men with a broom as Littlejohn and Bethany were leaving the store. And one of the 2 robbers turned around and shot him. Why Kenneth Meers would take such a risk by charging at 2 men that just robbed the store and were leaving, and at least one of them, if not both, were armed with a gun, is not really known. It definitely appears to have been a bad decision on his part. Some reports in the case files show Kenneth Meers, who was 31 years old, as a manager of the store, and other reports describe him as the owner or one of the owners. And it was possibly a situation where he was so infuriated by being robbed of his money that he decided to charge at the 2 perpetrators. Once again, not a good decision on his part. After the 2 men were captured and stood trial, Emmanuel Littlejohn was sentenced to death, and Glenn Bethany was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole. What makes this case interesting is how back then there might have been the general thinking that the shooter gets the death penalty and the accomplice gets life in prison. Well, Littlejohn has been saying, yeah, I was there. We robbed the place. But that his partner, Glenn Bethany, was the shooter. So there is some confusion as to why the judicial system back in the early 90s chose to give him death and life in prison for Bethany.
My name is Emmanuel Littlejohn, and I'm on death row for a crime that I didn't commit. I went in, then Bethany came in, and then we held the place up. I never said I wasn't a part of the robbery because I've always said that from the start that I was there. So I take off running, I go out the door, and next thing I know I hear a shot. I thought somebody was shooting at me, but it was Bethany shooting off inside the store.
By the way, Bethany is saying that Littlejohn was the shooter, and prosecutors at trial had leaned more toward Littlejohn being the shooter. Okay, first, remember that in the year 1992, surveillance camera systems were not widely used. Today, almost all convenience stores have them. And there were conflicting reports from witnesses in the general area, including 2 other employees that were in the store that day, as to whether the taller or shorter man was the shooter. As far as I can tell from the case files, it was not very clear to investigators who the actual shooter was. So why the difference in sentences is a bit of a mystery. I can tell you that in more recent times with such cases, the judicial system has taken the stance of, we don't care who the shooter was. Both criminals went into the store to rob it, and an innocent man inside was killed. Quite a few states have taken that stance and have sentenced multiple perpetrators in a crime to a death sentence for someone who was murdered. I think I spoke about this case once before in a previous video. To put this in perspective, I think it was in Florida years ago, where two guys entered a store to rob it, and they got into a shootout with the employee behind the counter inside. The employee ended up shooting and killing one of the robbers. Well, prosecutors later charged the surviving robber with the murder of his partner because the guy was killed during the commission of a crime that he was committing. So for anyone wondering why Littlejohn will be put to death while the other perpetrator spends the rest of his life in prison, because nobody really knows who the actual shooter was, maybe you should be wondering why both men weren't sentenced to death. It's not exactly clear how Emmanuel Littlejohn and Glenn Bethany were captured and arrested following the murder of the convenience store owner. Best I can tell, investigators working the case managed to identify the perpetrators pretty quickly. Remember, there were multiple witnesses at the crime scene, and police in Wichita, Kansas, in another state, arrested Littlejohn about a week later when the fugitive was found hiding in the home of his parents that lived there in Wichita. He was later extradited back to Oklahoma, where he stood trial in 1994 and was found guilty and sentenced to death. After the shooting, the convenience store's manager, or possibly owner, Kenneth Meers, was transported to Southwest Medical Center in Oklahoma, where he was pronounced dead a short time later. Kenneth Wayne Meers was born in 1960 in Indianapolis, Indiana, but had been living in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma for the past 20 years. He was just 31 years old. Kenneth was a member of Southern Hills Baptist Church. Kenneth had been managing the Root and Scoot convenience store for 18 years and took on greater responsibility when his father passed 8 years earlier in 1984. 15 years earlier, in that same convenience store, Kenneth Meers' father was also shot during a robbery, but he survived the shooting. Kenneth was survived by his mother, Dolores Meers. Please remember to hit the subscribe button so that you are alerted when the next video appears. You can also follow me on Facebook for updates and more death row news. There will be a link to my Facebook in the description below. My name is Paco Rivera. Take care and bye for now.